Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. So, over to the guys.
Hello, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
Right, so today then, Ian, we're still Counterfactual Universe, although this one's a bit of a left field one for us, not in Europe, in a different part of the world. Where we're going today?
So we're going to look at the journeys, or the what-ifs of the journeys of a Chinese admiral in the 12th century called...
Well, the consequences.
Oh, yeah, the consequences. Yes, indeed. Called Zheng He, or...
Mao Ha, or something.
Potentially Zheng Ho, depending on how it's pronounced, or even Ma He. But anyway, so he was a famous, in his own bathtub, as an admiral in the 12th century, did a series of voyages which could have been quite consequential, but essentially weren't. So the what if really is, what if they had been? So he came, he saw, he left, he went home.
That's right. I mean, ultimately, one of the key things associated with these treasure voyages was the ships that they used, which were, for their time, significantly bigger than anything else that had been built before. I think I was reading that one of them was rumoured to have 9 masts, 4 decks, and would hold 1,500 people, or 2,000, a lot of people. And the fleet itself had hundreds of ships. They weren't all 9-masted, 4-decked ships like that, but there was a lot of people, and I think they were, arguably 18 to 20,000 people, sailors, whatever, in the fleet, which is quite a significant amount of people, when you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're talking about the 15th century.
Yeah, 15th is not the 12th, as I said, the 15th century, yeah.
That's right. So I think what we're going to try and talk about is Chinese expansion, not necessarily about Zheng He himself, although he's a means to an end. It's more about, he's the means in terms of he was following known... I mean, that was another thing. He wasn't necessarily an explorer as such. He was following known trade routes, but he was looking to expand some of the Chinese influence in areas like the Horn of Africa and Somalia, places like that.
Yeah.
But in the real timeline, there's the reason that they stopped doing it was that it was to do with anybody who actually knows this, forgive me for the probably really bad misinterpretation of what went wrong, but there was some other Chinese leader from before who disapproved of that type of expedition. It was more about, it's better to look inwards than it is to look outwards. I mean, that is probably not accurate, but ultimately that was one of the reasons that they turned back or stopped doing it, was that some previous Chinese emperor, I'm trying to find where I read that as to why it's stopped. But anyway, so if we consider that China is obviously a very large country, it's funny when they talk about the Chinese Empire, but it's like, well, they didn't have an empire because they didn't have other countries, did they? Maybe this could have been a big country.
I can't understand, but they had an emperor for a long time. So
did they have an empire?
Yeah, but maybe it was just the amalgamation of the various Chinese tribes, for a better expression. Tribe isn't quite right, but there's various bits of China, and they're not all. It's not just one homogenous bunch of people, is it?
No, that's right. This was during the Ming Dynasty, so that preceded the Han Chinese, didn't it? I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, ultimately what we're talking about is China having a more expansionist approach to the world rather than being inward looking. So rather than, concentrating on China and having
Yeah,
forces.
so from what I read the other day or this morning is the reason they stopped expanding south and into the oceans was because they turned northwards, and they were concerned about the impact of the Mongolian people's tribes on China. So they had to address that. Not that they went. So they had a series of wars with the Mongolians, and that's where the Great Wall of China ultimately came from. So that sort of effort and impact reduced their willingness to go further south as a maritime nation, although they probably still did some of that. They certainly didn't go into the Indian Ocean again for a long time. Well, never did until the current day. So I think that's basically why it petered away. It came to nothing. There were trading posts in Java, as it was known then, or certainly known in Europe. So Indonesia, modern day Indonesia. There was on Ceylon, modern day Sri Lanka. As you say, there was trading posts up the Red Sea, around the Arabian Peninsula, Horn of Africa, Somalia, all that sort of stuff. But they fell away as they focused inwards on themselves.
Yeah. So I was just trying to find out. It was a policy of the Hongwu Emperor, who was the founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty, and he had this ban that prohibited shipping with something.
Shipping with something.
Well, it's Heijin Edict. I'm almost certainly pronouncing that wrong.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was. Hang on, I've just found something else. The Heijin or Sea Ban were a series of related isolationist policies in China restricting private maritime trading and coastal settlement during most of the Ming Dynasty. So the original emperor had this edict, this Heijin edict, was a sea ban. Now, so they were breaking that edict when Zheng He was doing his voyages, and then essentially they sort of, because the emperor who supported him, and I can't remember his name, it was the emperor, he was a eunuch, did you read that he was a eunuch admiral?
All right, it's old, isn't it?
Well, he was castrated when he was 14, apparently.
Yeah, to what purpose?
I think he was a slave. So he wasn't highborn in that sense. He was a Muslim.
Yeah, but why castrate somebody? To what? I mean, what's the purpose of that? I mean, a bit weird.
Well, I can't have any kids, So
but then,
says he was captured by the Ming armies in Yunnan in 1381. General Fu Yue, I'm mispronouncing this. General Fu Yude saw Ma He on a road and approached him to inquire about the location of the Mongol pretender. Ma responded defiantly, saying that the Mongol pretender had jumped into a lake. The general took him prisoner. He was castrated between the ages of 10 and 14 and placed in the service of the Prince of Yan, who was one of the potential heirs to the throne. So he was a kid, and then he essentially was put in the service of one of the heirs to the throne. They became friends. That's where his ability, that's where his status grew, is because this Prince of Yan, who wasn't necessarily the first heir to the throne, there were older, more eligible ones, but they died, and I won't say he got it by default, but it wasn't necessarily ultimately going to be his straight away. Anyway.
Okay, so I think we need to then move on and say, well, okay, so
I think we're concentrating too much on that.
If this admiral and/or his what's the opposite? Predecessor.
Yeah, if the Chinese emperors had suddenly gone into, look, there's a real opportunities for some massive expansion of our empire, where would we be with China on an expansionist?
Yeah. So, I mean, the purpose of an empire is to strip the country that you're taking over of assets, and potentially, if you're really lucky, sell them a load of cheap tat in return. But certainly, if you look around the area, so there's obviously, without looking, Google Maps and any map, you've got the Indian Ocean essentially. You've got the South China Sea. So you've got the Philippines. Well, we'll stick with modern names. You've got the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc. Burma, India, Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so I mean,
Arabian Gulf, and then down the west coast. Down the east coast of Africa.
That's right. So that all could have been a Chinese, empire, a bit like, say, the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. where it was North Africa and southern Europe, the coastal areas around the Mediterranean. This could be the coastal areas around the Indian Ocean. It could be.
Or it could have been like a Dutch equivalent where, certainly in the early days, primarily, or even to a certain extent the British, it was a trading, it was a trading empire, shall we say, where there was no requirement to take over the local administrations. But, so, I mean, the obvious thing with China, presumably even then, is they weren't short of manpower. So if...
That's right. I think they were still the most populous place country on the planet.
If they wanted to take over the country in its entirety rather than just as a trading post, I think they probably would. But then it's a question of, would you do that? I mean,
Well, I think there's evidence that China did have colonies, where people went, and suddenly there's a Chinese town. I think even on the Zheng He thing, there's something about in Indonesia where they found some Chinese settlement.
Yeah, but were they trading settlements or?
Well, no, I don't think so. No, but what I mean is that they could become a trading settlement, or they could have become a more militaristic.
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Is why did empires evolve? I mean, nobody sat down in 16 something or other and said, right, let's take over the whole of the North American continent. They started off with a colony here and a colony there, and then I mean, same as Australia. I mean, again, nobody's decided to, and then ditto. I mean, India was an even more interesting case, as it didn't really become the Raj inverted commas till after the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Revolution, whatever you want to call it, of 1850 something, 57. So,
but I mean, India's a case in point in terms of China, right? So so China doesn't border India, or it didn't at that time, but around and I'm not sure what the peninsula is called, where it's Burma or Malaysia and
the Arakan, I think it's called.
Right. So
but that Burma into what is now Bangladesh is the Arakan. Further down, Cambodia and stuff. I don't think that's called anything other than Cambodia, Laos, and
So the nearest part of India, Bengal, was obviously a very rich, wealthy part of the world. And it rivaled China. Well, it did later on, but I mean earlier.
For the ruling class it wasn't it? Yeah,
that's right. But I mean, if the Chinese wanted to expand, I don't know. I don't know when the Mughal emperors essentially took over Bengal. Because I mean, obviously, they weren't Indian; they were invaders. Who came in, took over.
Keep northern on Google it,
and then stayed. And they were Muslims, so not Hindu. So an equivalent type Chinese approach, particularly when you think that like the Mongol Empire, they were all into expansion.
15 something or other, 1500s.
So round about the same. Well, it's 100 years later then.
Yes, give or take. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we could postulate.
Sorry, just according to Google, it was the 21st of April, 1526. 2:30 in the afternoon. No, very, very specific. I don't know why. How can somebody can make such a specific statement?
We postulate that China, on an expansionist mentality, so if they went to take the land, they've got the means because they've got lots of resources. They've got.
But it would have been a very much a Dutch British model, surely, because it would have been going into the ports, starting off trading, and then starting off employing your own locals, and then starting off employing your own local people to protect everything, having your own little army, deciding, well, there's other parts of this country that are quite interesting now, and I've got my own little army. That sort of, I think you could definitely see that happening quite easily. But then I suppose was there a cultural reason why the Indian? I mean, it's divide and conquer, the classic mechanism. But was there would the Indians have objected more fervently to the Chinese as they did or didn't to the British and the Dutch?
Well, yeah, but you could. You're right. I mean, it's difficult to know whether whether we would say the Chinese went in more aggressively, or they are known as traders, and let's face it, we're talking about the Silk Road, which is part of this, and that was China to Europe, via India and North Africa and that sort of thing. So trading is something that they did. So if they wanted to trade and have a stronger hold, make more money from the trading routes, trade directly with people rather than through intermediates, you could see them expanding their trading empire into India, and then an Indian influx of Chinese resources. People, they've got plenty of people, probably got plenty of skilled artisans who could move into that sort of territory away from China, and China wouldn't notice the difference, because of the size of the population.
Okay, so is it a question then that, similar to the British Empire, India is the jewel in the crown? Because look at the other opportunities. There's a huge opportunity around Indonesia and Philippines, but those are there's a massive number of bits of those countries, lots of medium-sized islands, very difficult to identify, an immediate set of treasures, shall we say. So, in the 20th century, oil becomes the thing, and obviously the Dutch were trading on spices. Would there have been the same demand for spices in China?
I think so. Yeah, I'm assuming there was. Yeah, I just found a bit. I was trying to find in terms of there being Chinese communities, and there was Malacca, which is in Indonesia. Yeah, that had a sizable Chinese community anyway. So there's people had drifted into different areas within that part of the world. The South China Seas around there. Now, if you could see other sizable colonies of Chinese people on the trade routes, in other, you could end up with a sort of network of Chinese communities that then get turned into something a bit stronger than just a. Because
this is the thing. Ultimately, if they remain purely as, apart from the fact that, so let me finish this. If they remain purely as trading posts, Europeans will turn up at some point and turf them out. So the question is...
Well, we don't know that. There would be conflict.
They did everywhere else, didn't they? So why would
but don't forget, we're talking about a Chinese empire that's expansionist, whereas it never was during the
that's the question, though, is it? That's the question then, isn't it? What sort of empire is it? Is it based on trade and what comes along afterwards, or is it very much we're going to plant a flag here? I think I could be wrong here, but the difference, if you think of Indonesia as, using modern terms, Indonesia and India, those were very much trading, and then the control came later. And there were battles fought there against the French, obviously, not so much Indonesia, but in India. But America was different. America, from the outset, was always, again, because you could argue because of the lack of an economic model that was there already. But the French set up their own colonies, the Dutch set up their own colonies, the English and the British set up their own colonies, and they didn't really like each other from day one.
I think that if the Chinese empire stretched throughout that, that geography, I don't think that European colonies would have been as welcomed if the.
Oh no, how much they would be welcome? But that's the thing. They turn up with a. It'll have to be later, I guess, but they turn up a bit later with a well-armed man of war, and let's say the Chinese have got well-armed men of war.
Well, that's what I mean. So so we're not talking about a country that doesn't have large resources, large armies, large ability to manufacture stuff. Let's face it, the Chinese are well known for.
Are they going to be in India? Are they? I'm trying to think of a country which was pure. Maybe there isn't one. I'm trying to think of a country that was purely a trading nation and was happy. There are modern.
Well, the Portuguese is probably the one that you're thinking of. They were more trading. They wanted trading outposts. They didn't have a large.
They had plenty of colonies in Africa, though. Whether that was latter near the end, the 1890s, 1850s, and all that sort of stuff. You're right, but they were more primarily interested. But then in Brazil as well. So I mean, they managed somehow. Portugal's probably on the bottom.
No, but there weren't a lot. What I'm saying is, there's not a lot of Portuguese in the, because the Portuguese population is not that big. You can have
already in Brazil, didn't they?
it.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, but Brazil didn't have, a society. They were, ultimately they were in the middle of a jungle with lots of jungle
so
communities. They weren't Aztecs and Mayans and stuff like that they had to see.
It's just that depending which way you go, I mean, if it's purely a trading operation and they try to defend it, that takes us down one path. If it's we're going to take the country over empire and then do some trading afterwards, that's different as well, isn't it? Because that.
Well, which route do you want to? Which route do you want to?
Well, I think it's probably the Dutch / British and India model, where it's mostly trading and they're happily sort of in their cantons, to use it. They're in their areas and happily getting on with everybody else. And then suddenly realise, well, it's going to be difficult to keep doing this unless we keep expanding. You keep expanding, you have to take over other bits of the country, with the Moguls' permission or otherwise, and then you start butting up against other European countries who have got, like the French, and then you decide to have a war with them and you chuck them out. I think that's most likely for China. I think what we would be so we could sort of part that. What would be quite interesting is what they make of Africa, because the obvious, elephant in the room is Africa's got lots of resources, and some of the good ones are people. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit different down the east coast of Africa. It's not as heavily populated as the west coast of Africa. But the Arabs were taking slaves from Africa for many a hundreds of years from that part of Africa. So was slavery a thing in that part?
I don't know. I'm pretty. They had slaves in China. There's no doubt about that.
But who were they? I mean, were they people defeated in battle, or so were they essentially prisoners of war, or were they, being farmed? Because essentially what was happening in the Caribbean.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there's, our knowledge of it would suggest that the Chinese didn't have a huge slave.
But it's a bit cause and effect, isn't it? I mean, the reason that slave trade existed was because there was cotton and sugar to be, and all the things no doubt as well, but there was cotton and sugar, but primarily and tobacco, whatever, to be cultivated in the southern states of America and the British Caribbean.
Well, yeah, but don't forget there was the slave trade also went east. Like you say, through the Ottoman Empire was full of slaves, and
but was it as
the Arabian, the Persian?
Did they use them as intensively? I don't know, over a short period of time. I don't know.
Well, I think that I don't think there was. The North Atlantic one was different.
Well, it was a brief period. In fact, it was 150 years around a particular.
Yeah, and it was focused on one specific, one type of.
So the question
whereas I think the North African approach was that the slaves did lots and lots of things. They were worked in fields, worked to death, but they also were administrators. They were in the army.
Yeah,
but when
what would be in the Chinese Empire that would require, or is there anything in the Chinese Empire that would require significant numbers of African slaves?
Probably not. But it doesn't mean to say that when have slaves in their own country. There's a difference between having slaves and transporting slaves. So, say you wanted to, you get to the east coast of Africa, and to be fair, I'm not sure what the landscape is like, but I don't think it's not a desert. I think it's relatively lush.
It is, but I still don't think there's the same level of population. But
but what I'm saying is that it might be, it's probably a good place to grow stuff. Say you can grow rice there, for argument's sake.
Well, you can't grow rice. There's a lot of rice is grown in Kenya. So
you get,
as is tea, obviously.
So you get people who want to make a crop to sell. Who's going to do all of the work? Well, it's not going to be the boss, is it? It's not going to be the emperor who's coming in doing all of the work. So who would they import? Chinese peasants. I mean, let's face it, China's a very large country. It would have been a very large empire. It would have had a lot of people. Would it ship its own people, or would it enslave the people who were there? I mean, there's no
probably do both, because Britain did both. indentured labourers and criminals and all sorts of people. I mean, indentured labourers weren't criminals; they were just unfortunate who'd signed some bit of paper which was a bit dodgy. But they also had slaves at the same time. So whether they didn't necessarily do the same jobs, but you couldn't leave of your own accord until you paid the money back, and you couldn't afford to pay the money back because you were getting paid a pittance. So maybe they would do both. But this is interesting. So
it would have been local. For me, it would have been local. It would have been localised. It wouldn't have been ships transporting them.
Well, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree because I can't. When you've got a huge peasant population, you don't need.
They're already. Yeah, you don't need slaves. You've got them.
Yeah, hence why there was no slaves to speak of in Europe, because you've got that's not to say there weren't any, but there wasn't.
Well, they were serfs, weren't they? And
yeah. So and we
one up
say
on
Europe, include Britain and that. Your peasants who are starving from 1 month to the next class being held down. You don't need slaves. I mean, if you bring a load of slaves against them, you're going to cause a revolution, aren't you? Because they won't have anything to do at all. So I don't suspect that they would. But you're right. It's interesting if the Chinese. I mean, it's very tempting for me because it's easy, but I think there's a degree of truth in it. It's very easy for the Chinese model to follow the British one, and the British one. I'm using the British one because it just fits that geographic area, which is in India. The Chinese kind of do what the British did, which was take the raw materials out and ship stuff back, and obviously ship stuff out, to its own market around the world using cheap commodities. And then obviously in Kenya there was tea plantations. There's cotton now. It probably wasn't in the early 20th centuries. Cotton. There's certainly bits of rice. I don't know how much rice, but some of these places, because they're huge, can actually produce huge amounts of things. And you think, I didn't know that. So would they have developed that? The question is ultimately to what market? Because a lot of the British market, not for foodstuffs, but for cotton, or not so much cotton, but for linen, went to North America. So it's a hell of a long way to North America from China, although across the Pacific. But then the Pacific board of America seaboard wasn't particularly developed until middle of the 1800s
but Europe was there.
It was a long way from China is Europe.
I know, but don't forget we've got the Silk Road that's sending lots and lots of bits.
Well, that was more of
we talk about.
That was a late medieval thing, wasn't it? Could you send?
I don't think so. I think even when Zheng He was on his travels, he was following the route.
Well, that was 1400, wasn't it? All right, so maybe late medieval,
15th
not right.
century.
Yeah,
well, that's medieval, isn't it? 15th.
Well, no, it is. It is. Well, that's what I'm saying, isn't that? Did that Silk Road, inverted commas, survive the Industrial Revolution? I mean, I don't think it did it? I mean,
I thought that it did.
Well, okay.
We're still getting spices from spices from before.
You're right, but were they coming by ships by that point? They weren't getting across the top of India and through Syria and Turkey and stuff. But I'm not saying
I think they were going by ships and then to up through North Africa and then by land.
You say North Africa? Do you mean North Africa or do you mean the Middle East?
Well, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, that bit.
So the Arabian Peninsula.
The Arabian Peninsula and around there.
Yeah,
isn't that the way the Silk Road goes?
I don't really know. I don't actually know. I think it was more north than that. I thought it went through what is now Pakistan.
Did it go through Iran?
Yes, I think Pakistan, Iran, the bottom of sort of the parts of Turkey, which is Kurdistan.
In the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, that sort of way. But bear in mind, there's no Suez Canal, obviously. So
no, that's right.
Yeah. So you can only get so far up the Red Sea.
But then the Europeans who were shipping it round the Cape of Good Hope, to
Well, exactly. But we were talking about getting to what's their market. But what I was going to say is that China's a huge country, so the market for tea and cotton and stuff. And we're talking really much further on from the 1500s, but the 17, 1800s when the British presence in India exploded. Well, not literally, but it blossomed, shall we say?
But if we do what you say and follow the British model of trading first, then the trading could have started and lasted 100, 200 years before it turned into something more significant in terms of
100%
administrative.
100%. So and then moving rapidly forward, there's a lot of interesting questions about what would that made China more stable would that have prevented the European and the Americans setting up essentially little colonies along its coast? Trading colonies, inverted commas. It split the country into several factions of warlords. Would it have stopped all that? And again, jumping even further forward, when Japan industrialized, what would Japan make of China? If it was a
If it was even that part of China,
yeah. Well, that's true. That's an interesting thought. I mean, China did try and invade Japan at some point
twice, didn't it? With Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan.
That was the original divine wind that destroyed the Chinese fleet, the kamikaze.
That's right. Yeah.
So the whole, and then obviously you got this situation where Britain doesn't have its jewel in its crown. The British Empire would then consist of mostly Caribbean colonies, some African ones. Although the African colonies were, with the exception of South Africa, came on quite late in the British Empire and didn't add a great deal.
Yeah, so the whole spice trade that Europe, the Dutch and the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, that potentially wouldn't have existed in any.
Well, it might. This is my point earlier on. It might
the same shape.
Yeah, it might have done because they might have turned up and says we want a bit of this, and we've got. It depends what
we got bigger guns than you.
Yeah, it depends what year we speak of. But the problem is, if the Chinese were unified, in as much as their country was reasonably together, and they created this empire, and it was quite rich, and they had obviously military. You could lose a battle. The Europeans could lose a battle, win a battle. They could win Java, but they got to hold on to it. They could win a battle,
right, yeah.
And then a long way from home. And ultimately, I think if the Chinese were together, they would beat off the Europeans, assuming they even tried. So it would be a very powerful empire, and some of the other empires wouldn't exist.
That's right.
These colonies were jewels in the crown. The Dutch. The Dutch Empire, a couple of islands in the Caribbean, but Dutch East Indies. The French had, the French Indochina, wouldn't have that. The British of India, might have bits of it still, who knows, but they might have got bits that the Chinese didn't, further, what is now Pakistan, further west. But again, those weren't particularly fertile areas and all the rest of it.
No, so that's right. I mean, you could argue that even if the full extent of whatever this mythical Chinese empire was in the Indian Ocean, and even if it then split up, it would still, into some more independent countries, as let's face it, is likely to have happened.
Well,
because
exactly.
They don't want overlords all the time, depends on how they would deal with the locals. But it would be there'd be a significant influence by the Chinese in that area, much more than there is now.
Yeah, I mean, they can't have dealt with them any worse than the Europeans dealt with them. So, I mean,
Yeah, but you think countries like Cambodia and Vietnam wouldn't exist? They'd just be part of China.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I don't know enough about Vietnam and Cambodia in terms of.
I mean, they're ethnically and culturally different, but how much of that is because that's the way it is, rather than what if the Chinese had invaded in 1500 and performed some form of genocide? Well, there wouldn't be much culture left, would they? And flooded the countries with their own ethnicities or people. There's plenty of examples of that over a long period.
Well, it's interesting. When you think about it, it's like, why didn't China take over those landlocked?
Well, it tried, because it looked.
I don't know.
As I read it, it looked inward and northwards, because those countries pose no threat. So it's a bit of it's a bit of, as soon as you start, those countries pose no threat to them. But the Mongolians did. So they were obsessed with the Mongolians, spent all the time and effort keeping the Mongolians out. And that was their mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And as they were doing that, their country wasn't bringing in lots of resources, didn't have an empire, focused on itself, focused even more on itself, and it started to split up into territories run by warlords. And it's sort of a spiral, it's a downward spiral, isn't it? Countries that spend all their time obsessing about themselves generally don't do that well, do they? I mean, it's a bit of a look at Russia. It's sense to look at America now, God's sake. But
sure, I'm just looking at Vietnam. So Vietnam, a long time ago was part of China.
Uh-huh.
So it was under Chinese rule from 111 BC until essentially.
That's a long time ago.
No, until 939, right? So, so for 1,000 years.
Yeah, long before most European countries even existed.
Oh, yeah. And, but then there was, you get this sort of, so they were, they became very Chinese influenced because of Confucianism and Buddhism, which expanded that way. And it says during most of the 17th and 18th century, Vietnam was effectively divided into two domains. But this was because there was another clan that had essentially taken up, from 939. I haven't got really time to read all of this, but thinking there's something quite interesting here potentially. Chinese Empire and Vietnam, Cambodia.
Yeah, but there are lots of examples. There are lots of examples of other countries taking over other countries and essentially not having any trouble doing that, and just look at the Normans taking over England, for example. So the Normans took over England, chucked all the nobles out, killed the king, etc., built castles, subdued the population. 100 years later, nobody can remember anything different. All right. So English is a funny language, but now because we've got a bit of French and a bit of Anglo-Saxon, but essentially nobody sits around in England seething that the Normans are lording it over them. Or, I don't know. I mean, that must have been the case for a while, but within 150, and they did do a lot of horrible pillaging and raping and stuff in the north of England. So he did suppress the population literally by the sword. So there are, so they could have done that, if they wanted to.
Well, I think they try. I'm just looking a bit further. So it looks like from a Vietnam perspective, if part of China, then they end up with some sort of warlord who you could argue would probably consider himself Chinese.
Well, there's over time that diverges.
That's right. But
from his original
he
Chinese.
created his own army and repelled the Ming dynasty, and they even repelled 3 Mongol invasions.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously they were very good and created their own independent
example. Look at North America, for example, or the United States of America more specifically. That's exactly what they did. They were originally, ethnically British, literally part of Britain to one degree or another, and then suddenly aren't, and then divert away. All right, still 60% similar, but you wouldn't put a Brit and an American and say, oh, these are the same people. No, they're not, patently not. I'm not talking about DNA testing. I'm talking about their outlook on life and the rest of it. Yes, it's very similar, but they're not the same. So you can see why.
Oh, actually, so in the Ming dynasty, they did overthrow the local Vietnam.
Yeah, well,
briefly.
Yeah,
with the Ho dynasty, it was called. Yeah, that they overthrew.
So getting back to our proposition is it's too big to go into detail, but there's 2 options here, isn't there? Either these countries are subsumed in a successful larger empire, and 400 years later you can't tell the difference, or it never really beds in, and similar to the British Empire and every other empire over time, or most empires, the underlying ethnicities and countries breaks through. It's just a question of how painful that is. And if the external event causing it, the external event obviously for European colonies was the Second World War. Again, we haven't got time to go into who could China have been having a Second World War with in the industrial age. As you say, Japan maybe, but Japan might have been Chinese. America, possibly. European countries, possibly, but then the European countries are less relevant if they haven't got an empire in the backyard of China.
If you had if China was a bigger, more solid, empire,
yeah,
then when you look at other empires in that particular part of the world, and I'm thinking of either the Ottomans or the Indian Empire, they used to import a lot of European expertise. As because they've got lots of money, in particular the French,
but expertise for what? In what?
Well, architecture, warfare, cannons, you name it.
Well, yeah, but that begs the question.
They'd sell it.
That begs the question, though, is if the Europeans didn't have an empire in the Far East and India, would they have such expertise?
Well, but they're gaining expertise in Europe, don't they? They don't gain
yes and no. The British didn't to any degree.
No, but when you're making muskets and improving muskets, or you're improving
Yeah. That's true,
technology.
yeah,
You're
true
talking about the Industrial Revolution, that type of thing.
Yeah, but then what? But then you've got to pay for them, haven't you?
If it's a big empire that's got lots of resources, because
Yeah.
it's got,
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. We're talking about China that's got a lot more going for it in terms of potential.
So let's run a plausible scenario up into the mid 20th century. I think is that China does not break up into its warlordy parts as it did in the regional. It has colonies through Indonesia, the Philippines, which are reasonably stable. It's sucking resources out and sending rubbish out in other directions that people want to buy, or steam engines and stuff, as per the Industrial Revolution. It's got maybe most of India, maybe not the northern bits and the western bits, which are now Pakistan, and bits of disputed territories in the north with Pakistan and stuff. It might have a colony or two in Africa for tea growing and stuff, but I don't think it really wants to go marching off into the centre of Africa to any purpose. It's very much driven by trade, but with a sword in the other hand, sort of thing. And I think that, and the question then, I suppose, is would it have had an industrial revolution? But you say if it's rich, it can buy that stuff in. I mean, the Ottoman Empire wasn't as developed as other economies, but it certainly had, it had modernised through the Industrial Revolution, steam trains and factories and all the rest of it, and it would produce its own weapons and stuff. So then it's an entirely different conversation. Does it sustain itself, or does it collapse like most empires do?
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and most empires collapse. So ultimately, it would have shrunk. There's no doubt about that, because that's just what happens to empires, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's interesting to consider what factors would have caused that. I mean, that's much too much to speculate, but it could have been on
it could have been the intrusion of the European nations. Could have shaken it up.
Yeah, and
it wouldn't have gone the way that it went. It would be different.
I know nothing at all about Chinese society, full stop. So I have no idea if because in Great Britain, I can only speak for Great Britain. In the 20th century, many people were becoming against the principle of empire. So the fact that it all fell apart is one thing, but people didn't care. So they actively wanted rid of the empire because it was wrong. So whether that would have happened in China, I'm not saying the majority of people were thinking that in 1920, but there was plenty of intellectuals thinking that, and then the Labour Party were thinking it, and etc. And it built up a momentum. And then when the war came along, it says, "What the hell am I fighting for the British Empire and Burma for?" etc. etc. Well, when you say that, I just don't know. I mean, I don't know if China.
I don't think so, because don't forget, Britain was a democracy, and China would have a supreme leader who was there by birth. And
much as the Ottoman Empire, I suppose, was. Yeah, so and I'm not aware of anybody in Turkey pressing to give up the Ottoman, but
it collapsed because of other external factors.
Because they lost the First World War, essentially.
Well, now that was it was already in a massive decline.
Well, indeed, right, it was, but it literally gone within the space of 2 or 3 years or whatever. But yeah, well, okay, it's an interesting thing about the democracy, isn't it? It is, there's plenty of intellectual scholars in Chinese society through the ages. I mean,
arguably you could say that if in this particular timeline, China wouldn't be, it would be as technologically advanced as.
So you're saying we're saying, and I think I agree. Well, let me say it first, but I think what you're saying is that if it would fail, but it would fail through external events, there would be no post-Second World War equivalent of giving up colonies because it's the right thing to do. There would be. We don't think that would be a plausible scenario.
No, I don't believe it'd be communist. It'd be, it would fall into some other domain. I think China in the probably a right wing military. Yeah, a bit more like what it is today rather than what it was in the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
So it would be it'd probably be the dominant world power, arguably.
Well, dominant world power. It's had an empire for 400 years. That's a bit counterintuitive, though, because empires don't.
No, you're right. But it would be technologically advanced. I think that it would be a.
But how does it keep all these diverse? Assuming they've not all been massacred over hundreds of years, but how does it keep all these diverse people with different views on everything?
Well, no. If it was what I'm saying is, if it shrunk,
yeah,
doesn't mean to say that it would collapse. It would just shrink.
Oh no, I don't know. No, 100%. I mean, it depends really. If it did fail as a result of an external world war, in inverted commas, it depends who was fighting and who won, obviously, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
because Britain Britain with its allies won the Second World War and still got rid of all the colonies. But as did America, got rid of the Philippines, although it was always kind of going to be doing that anyway. But then had no wish to take over other countries, even though they were essentially defeated. So it's unless again we're into sort of version number 62 here. Unless it became some horrendous military power like Japan or Nazi Germany, which there's no evidence.
That's right.
There's no evidence of that. I mean,
well, it's another potential string if we ever come back to this one. I mean, we'll have to leave it there. It's weird, just a shout out to our listeners. It'd be great if we could get some feedback. Don't know whether we've got any Chinese listeners. We haven't got anybody in China or that part of the world according to the analytics. Not yet. So there's space, and we would love to hear some feedback.
Yes, because apparently we know nothing about China.
That's right, but there's some real opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, looking at it as a resource-rich country in the 1500s, why did it turn so inbound? If it had not turned so inward on itself, the world would be a different place.
Yeah, it'd be a very different place. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening. We'll be back soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
That's it. Now we know you enjoyed that. Or maybe you didn't. But why not let us know what you think? But you can go on Twitter, or X if that's the way you get dressed, and search for ORC_time to find us. On Facebook, simply search for Conversations in Time and leave your thoughts right there.